Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. So I'm very glad to introduce, firstly, Cliodhna Taylor. So Cliodhna worked for several years in ONS on labour market statistics and developing data sets and methodology in that area. And then Cliodhna was seconded to HMRC to develop methodologies underlying the real-time information statistics. And ultimately her work there made the monthly publication possible. And so then Cliodhna became the head of the team producing that publication. And now that that's all set up and running, Cliodhna's now back in ONS and is working on methodologies to better reflect the digitalisation of the economy in a national accounting framework, which sounds absolutely fascinating. And our second speaker is Deb Leaker. And so Deb currently works in the coordination team within labour market at ONS. She's worked for ONS for about 20 years, and in labour market for around 5 years. She's done a number of roles within labour market, but at the moment her main role is putting together the materials for the monthly labour market publication, and she works closely with the team at HMRC on the RTI publication. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing those two perspectives from both the HMRC side and the ONS side on the development of these impressive new statistics. So timing wise, Cliodhna, I think you have 40 minutes for your talk, so you should probably aim to wrap up by 3:15, and then Deb, I think you had 20 minutes, but you told me your talk is actually going to be shorter than that, so we'll probably either have more time for Q&A at the end or give people back a piece of their day. So thank you both very much for your time today to present this, and over to you, Cliodhna.
Right, so thank you very much for that. First off, can I just check that people can hear me?
Yeah.
Great stuff. So now let's see if I can get the technology to work, and I'll see if I can share my presentation. So let me know when you can see my screen.
Yep. All good. Is that?
Right, perfect. Rightio then. So yes, I'll get cracking because we've got quite a lot of hopefully very interesting stuff to cover. So what I want to talk about today, so first off, just for anybody not acquainted with it, I'll talk about exactly what we mean when we talk about the pay-as-you-earn RTI data, a little bit about what it is, so I can give you the context for the methodological work that we've done. So then we'll talk about that actual methodological work, so how exactly do we make this data into good labour market statistics, and then we'll relate it to the topic that everybody's been talking about since at least March. We'll talk about how those methodologies have been really important to the statistical response to COVID-19 and how we track the labour market over that time. And then finally, I want to just give a bit of extra flavour because these methodologies are actually quite broad reaching and were designed not just for producing statistics, but also with analysts in mind. So I'll talk a little bit about what potential these data hold for analysts. So to start off then, let's talk about the PAYE RTI data. RTI began introduction in April 2012 and was fully introduced by April 2014. And so this is a process where employers have to notify HMRC about employment payments around the time that those payments are made. And that includes information about the payment and anything relating to it, such as tax deductions or other relevant information that's related to the payment. So the coverage of this data set is all employers must register for PAYE RTI and report under it, where they have at least one employee who earns above the lower earnings limit. And I've given an example for the latest year of what that limit is. Or they have at least one employee who has another job. So it covers a vast array of employees. I do really want to highlight, though, that the PAYE RTI data set is just a data set of employees, so it doesn't cover the self-employed. Once or twice you may see me and others slip into talking about employment. That's technically a mistake. Just to highlight, it is just employees. So if we go on to the next slide. Um, so that's what the process of reporting tax and other relevant information is through PAYE RTI. But for our statistical purposes, the actual data set that you obtain from it, it's a data set of payments. And this may sound quite pedantic, but it's really important for what we're going to talk about for the methodologies coming here. So what are payments? Well, they're discrete events. A payment happens at a particular point in time. Um, and that's a little bit different to when we talk about employment. When we ask people about employment, you might ask your friend, do you currently have a job? Um, and that's sort of a continuous status that somebody has over time from when they start their job to when they end it. So you have this contrast. We have a data set of payments, discrete events, but we want to talk about continuous statuses over time. So that's one feature of the data set to draw your attention to. But then even within that, there's a distinction to be drawn between the period in which payment occurs and the period in which employment may occur. So you may undertake employment in January, for example, but only be paid for it at the start of February. So those are two things about the data set really to keep in mind. Um, so what we have in the RTI data, we have quite a few bits and pieces that we can draw together to take us from those definitions of that come along with a payment, of it being a point in time event, and we can actually we can reorganize the data. So from that, we derive estimates of those continuous employment spells. So the data that we have within RTI are people's start dates for their jobs. We have the payment dates for the particular payments that they receive, as well as the payment frequencies that somebody gets paid for the job. So we know not just when they receive those payments, but how often they should receive those payments. So from that, we can infer periods of non-payment when somebody may be on unpaid leave, for example. And finally, we have the leaving date. So we can use all this data together to process it in a process that we refer to calendarization, which is going to take us from having this payments data set to having a data set of continuous employment. So I'm going to run through a sort of a simplified example of that process. But for anybody who's interested, all of this, as well as details of the nitty gritty and the extra refinements that we add, they're all published online. They were published in December 2019 in an article that I've named here. The most easy way to find this article, though, is if you go on the ONS website, and if you search for RTI, you'll find actually it's the first result that you'll get will be this methodological paper, and then the second result you'll get normally is the monthly bulletin that we're now publishing. So here's a sort of simplified example of a case. So what I've tried to draw is diagrammatically here, this worked example. So imagine somebody is paid every 4 weeks on a Friday. So those payments are shown by the blue dots in the chart. So somebody receives £2,000 every 4 days on a Friday. But then the final payment for this job, it's actually half the normal amount. And that's shown by the blue dot at around 1,000 towards the end of the chart. So we get those payment informations. They're all shown as a dot to show that they're a point in time event. But in addition, we get somebody's start date and leaving date. So, for example, we do know that the leaving date occurs halfway between the two final payments. So what would happen if we just sort of naively process this data with a bit of a crude estimate that if somebody's paid during a month, then they're employed during that month, and somebody's pay rates for a month are just equal to however much payment they receive during that month. So this is what the data would look like, and you can immediately see why there's some issues. So for example, this person was paid every 4 weeks which doesn't neatly match up with calendar months. So there does occur in May 2020 in this example, a month in which they received 2 payments. So if you just simply summed up someone's payment during the calendar month, actually you would arrive at this more volatile data. But in particular as well, you have this occurrence where we also have data for December 2020, and we have their pay being half. But what we actually know from looking at that example earlier is that their leaving date, they left their job halfway between um, their penultimate payment and their final payment. So that final payment, it's half the amount, but that's because somebody's last pay period, they only worked for 2 weeks of it. So we have this issue where we're recording somebody's being employed during December 2020, where we know from their leaving date that they left in November. But also, we have this strange occurrence where their pay is lower right at the end of their employment, which, based on this example we've done, actually, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, we might not interpret them as having any fall in pay, really. So, how can we improve on this? So the process of calendarization has 2 broad steps. The first really easy step, they're both fairly simple actually in concept. The first one is that we calculate a pay rate for someone, a pay per unit of time. This means that we can compare people who are being paid at all different rates. When we publish the RTI data, we convert their pay into pay per month, and along international guidelines, month is defined as a period of 30.44 days. So we calculate a pay rate for each period, each pay period they have. And then secondly, we calculate their continuous employment profile. So what I was talking about earlier, we take their start date, we take their leaving date, and we take their the period between their payments, and all of that is a period of continuous employment. So what we end up with is this new yellow line that I've got drawn on here. So what I've done, I've still got the dots in place to show when the payments occur. But what we have here is I've drawn this straight line to show when we know that they're continuously employed. So it begins in their start date and it ends in their leaving date. You can see, for example, that we have the start. This extends their period of employment right to the start of January, and it terminates their employment right at the end of November. But I also want to draw your attention to the fact that by doing this, we've shifted up their pay. It's continuous over the entire period. So that final pay period, when they were working just 2 weeks, whereas for all of their other payments, we were taking them and their payments for 4 weeks of work. So we would sort of take their payment of 2,000, divide it by 28 for the 28 days. So we'd get a pay rate per 28 days, and then multiply it by 30.44 to get to the monthly amount. For that final pay period, instead of dividing the payment by 28, we divided by 14 to acknowledge the fact that it was pay, but only for 14 days of work. So then, when we multiply it to get to monthly pay, we see that that person is being paid the same amount per unit of time throughout this period. So what we essentially end up with then is really a daily profile of whether somebody has a job for each day, and then for that period of employment, we're asking how much are you being paid for that period of employment, and that's what this data shows. So then the data that's actually published is taking that daily data of whether somebody's employed on each day and how much they're being paid for that period of employment, and it just averages it over the calendar month. And this is what the difference of those monthly data end up looking like. And you can see that going from the raw data that had these upward spikes and then the downward spikes, actually we've ended up with smoother data that reflects the fact that this person, for example, in their contract is probably being told that you'll be paid a certain amount per month, and that amount has been constant. So the effect of this calendarization is in particular, it helps with these sorts of periods where somebody's pay may not perfectly overlap with calendar months because they're being paid weekly or fortnightly or 4 weekly, for example. And as well, it really better captures when somebody starts a job and when somebody ends a job. So that's the key methodology for the RTI data. But we also have to do a little bit of extra work to be able to really make this data timely. And this is really the key thing about creating statistics during the time of COVID, that timeliness is more important than ever. So even once we've done that to the data, we have an issue that the raw RTI data are essentially backwards looking. So, for example, the base assumption of this calendarization model is that jobs are essentially being paid in arrears for the work done for the period somebody was employed. So, somebody's employed, then at the end of that period, they're paid. But also, um, we have an issue because sometimes leaving dates aren't reported alongside somebody's final payment. So we also have this issue that if, for example, we are calculating the latest statistics and we haven't seen that somebody's paid yet, we can't discern whether somebody's just being paid, whether the employer has failed to report to HMRC on time. We can't discern that. Or we can't discern whether somebody's left their job, but their employer just hasn't reported a leaving date. So we have this issue um, that's compounded by these complicating factors. So a very small amount of payment data are supplied to HMRC after the payment date. So even after the end of a calendar month, we won't have completely full data on all the payments that correspond to that payment month. As well as the fact, like I just said, that start dates and leaving dates are not reported, or sometimes they might be reported, but they contain some very unlikely values. So for these reasons, after the end of the month, we still arrive at this situation where we don't have full data. In particular, one of the things that results from this calendarization methodology is that when you get a payment for somebody, because we're looking at the data in arrears, all you know is their employment status up to the point of that payment. So, for example, if somebody's paid during the middle of the month, you only know their employment status for the first half of that month, and you need to wait for their next payment in the middle of the next month before you know the second half of the month. So, for example, if you're looking at somebody's status in November, halfway through November, you'll get the data for the first half of November, but you'll have to wait until the middle of December to know the status of the second half of November. So if we want to create really timely statistics of data for November, perhaps before the middle of December, we need to impute that last little bit. So I sort of summarized that here by saying that by the end of the month, we tend to have about 80 to 90% of the data that we need on how much employment there is in that particular month. So for that extra 10 to 20%, we need to do some amount of imputation to the data to be able to produce timely statistics. So what follows is an explanation of how we do that imputation. But before this, I do want to highlight the way in which these imputation methods, we really need to think outside the box from traditional imputation methods with surveys. That imputing administrative data presents some fundamentally different problems. The key one of these is that we do not have a sample frame. Because this is not a sample, we do not have a preset universe that we're going to weight our data to hit some population totals. Instead, our data are the universe and are going to construct the sample frame. So we need to try and take the data that we have, and from that, we also need to impute to try and get to the universe. So we can't work backwards from that. So it's a fundamentally different problem and quite a lot of weighted survey statistics. we had to think quite innovatively about how to do this, and this was done in cooperation between ONS and HMRC. And what we came to was this methodology where fundamentally, to impute somebody's employment status, we're going to try and impute two things. We want to know how many jobs have started and how many jobs have ended. And if we know those two flows, then we can use them to know about what the stock of jobs is. So first off, let's talk about jobs ending. Um, so if we're looking at the latest month, if we have not yet received a valid leaving date for a job, and where the most recent payment occurred before the end of the reference period, um, so for example, if we're looking at November still, oh, I think somebody's possibly unmuted. So yes, if we're looking at November and we've not yet received a valid leaving date for that job, but for example, they're paid in the middle of November, so we need to figure out whether they're going to receive a December payment, so we know whether or not they were employed towards the end of November. What we do is we calculate the possibility that the next payment is going to be received. And we calculate this possibility modeled on historic data, which takes into account the payment frequency of the job and the time it's been since the previous payment was received. So the whole idea about this is if you're being paid monthly, and we received your payment for the 28th of November, and all we've got to do is figure out the possibility you're going to receive a December payment, and we know it's been a couple of days since our last payment. We've not received a leaving date, but based on historic data, there's going to be a really high possibility that if you've not reported a leaving date, but you're paid monthly, you're going to receive that December value. However, if, for example, you've got somebody who's paid weekly, and it's been a month since their last payment and they've not reported a leaving date, if they're paid weekly but it's been a month since they were last paid, they're going to have a lower possibility of receiving that next payment. So we calculate these possibilities, and they give us a series of weights. So if there's a 90% possibility, then we have a weight of 0.9. If we have a 50% possibility, it's a weight of 0.5. So it provides this quite intuitive way of looking at it. It's the case that if you've got two people and you think the possibility for each of them is 0.5 that they'll have a job in the next month, then for two people, each of them have a possibility of 0.5. You think on average, the expected amount of jobs in the next month is going to be just the one, times each of them by 0.5. So that's what we do there. And that gives us an idea for all of the people who are previously employed, how likely are they to be employed in the next period. So then what we need to do is we need to add in the new jobs as well. So that will account for jobs that have been lost, but we need to add in the jobs that have been started. So what we do here is we take the number of new jobs that we've received so far, and where we can, we weight these up based on a concept very similar to response rates from similar points in history. So if we're looking at 3 days after the fact, we look historically 3 days after the fact, what proportion of new job payments would we have received so far? If it's just picking a number off the top of my head, if it's 90% of new payments we should have received, then we add in that extra 10% that we need, that we will expect to get eventually. So that's what we do when we already have some amount of payments. So for example, when we're trying to deal with late payments, but because of the way that the calendarization works, we also need to do a certain amount of forecasting. So for example, some people are paid quarterly, which if we're talking about November again, we need to calculate November employment. If somebody was last paid in October, the payment that's going to tell us whether they were employed in November is going to occur in January. So we need to impute January payments for quarterly paid people in order to calculate whether they were employed in November. So we need to do a little bit of forecasting in order to calculate employment for that particular month. And taking that example, we might not yet have very many at all very early reportings of payments that are going to be paid in January. So we might not have any base to work from in order to weight them up. So in that case, we just have a very simple forecasting technique of just carrying forward the growth rate for new jobs from previous months where we can weight them up, just to account for these very few amount of people who have these rather long payment periods. But we add on top of this an extra innovation. So what that process does is it will give you the aggregate number of new jobs. But a key thing for providing analysis and providing the sort of statistics that we want to produce, like distributional data, like medians, we need to not just be able to produce aggregate number of new jobs. It's incredibly helpful to have detailed microdata for what these new jobs might look like. So if we're dealing with that situation of we have 90% of the data, but we need to add in an extra 10%, we actually want to create some microdata for what those 10% payments might look like. So the approach that we've taken is inspired by the literature of synthetic data to take these aggregated estimates that we've produced, take the aggregated estimates of how many new jobs do we think they will be in total, and actually give them individual responses of what we think that those payments may look like. So this synthetic-like data creation, I've really provided a really simplified and butchered version of what synthetic data creation proper looks like on the left and what our version looks like on the right. So synthetic data creation, it's about making sure data are non-disclosive. It's about taking real data sets and driving the attributes of that data set, the qualities of that data set, the dimensions of it, like the means, the spread and the skew for different strata, and then adding in some randomness to that data to generate new individual responses so that the individual responses don't actually represent the exact data of real people. And in that way, they're non-disclosive. That's synthetic data set creation. We take a similar-ish approach. So what we're doing in our forecasts or our weighted up aggregate totals is we're calculating the dimensions of the data. And we can calculate the dimensions of the data that we've not yet received, but we expect to receive. So we can calculate how many employments there are, what the mean of those the pay for those employments should be. So we take those and then we go into the previous year's data and we look at, for the same time last year, if we're running the system on, what's the day today, the 18th of December, as of the 18th of December last year, what are the responses that we wouldn't have received yet? And we pick out those microdata observations and we recalibrate the data so that it now hits the aggregate totals of our forecasted data. So it takes all of the different dimensions of the data, such as the regional distributions, the pay distributions, all of the different, every single possible dimension of the data. And it gives us microdata that we can use to analyze those, but ensures that it hits certain dimensions of the data that we forecasted from our latest, for the latest year. So the end result of this is we drive microdata that have various attributes of the data that we've either calculated from early responses or that we forecasted, but it gives us a real granularity that you get from the microdata so that you can do any sort of analysis on it that you would like. So why exactly do we need to do this? So one of the things to point out is when it comes to weighting up the data in those periods where we can weight, this just gives a very similar result to if we used stratified weighting. So if we weighted on the various strata of the data, if we stratified the data on the different dimensions like geography, but if we did it for every single dimension of the data that we had, it would provide a very similar result. But one of the key things about this is it lets us have microdata to work with for periods where we're essentially forecasting the data, and we have to forecast the aggregates where we don't yet have any microdata responses to work from to weight up. So that we can still calculate things like medians and the distribution of the data and whatever else we might want to analyze. So yes, it's essential based on that fact that for some of the periods, we don't yet even have a sample of the data. So that is all of the methodology stuff. So finally, actually penultimately, I want to talk about actually how these data performed during COVID. And I think in general, it's been really positive. So what I've got here in this chart is the various first estimates we had for the growth in seasonally adjusted payroll employees for each month. Either the flash estimate, which we introduced in April 2020. Actually, the publication was in May 2020. But this, the flash estimate in orange, that occurred, that's published about 15 days after the end of the month. So, for example, the estimate for March 2020 in orange there, that was published around the middle of April. So, of an incredibly timely estimate of the number of payrolled employees. Previously to that, we were publishing around 45 days after the end of the month, and those estimates are shown in the blue bars there. So the thing that was incredibly useful about even our flash estimates of the RTI data is that our initial estimate of the number of payroll employees falling by just over 1.5%, that number was pretty on the mark in terms of it's not been revised as of the latest estimates, that actually that initial estimate was quite reliable. This sort of provides an evaluation of that imputation methodology that we were talking about earlier. That it looks like it did a really good job of imputing that extra 10 to 20% of the data that we needed to add in. And similarly, as we go on to subsequent months, it's generally done a good idea of giving an indication of how much the data move in each month. One of the caveats that we do want to give to this, though, is previously, prior to the coronavirus pandemic, we were only looking at the RTI data, comparing month on same month a year ago. Similar to a lot of monthly series, we really wanted to draw users' attention not to the monthly data, month on month movements, which can represent some amount of volatility. But before this, we were just looking at the annual growth rates. But as with a lot of other publications, with everything being so fast moving and having such large movements associated with the pandemic, there has been this increased focus on the monthly growth rates. So the evaluation of this really is that when we have had those sorts of big movements, such as in April and May, it has done a good job of showing when there are those large movements. If you're in periods where the movements have been a bit smaller, such as from August, September, October, including June and July, you find that there's a couple of 0.1, 0.2 percentage points that that can be revisions by. There have been instances where it's moved them from being positive to negative. So for those real fine details, we still advise users to treat these the flash estimates with caution for that reason. When you're looking at that real granularity, it needs to be taken into account. But it has done a really good job at showing when there were these big movements, particularly during the initial onset of the pandemic. So that sort of is how the data have performed in terms of their flash estimate. But another thing that's been really useful about the RTI data is their analytical capability of digging down a little further into the data. So one of the curiosities that's come out from the labour market during the COVID pandemic, particularly in the more recent months, is the strength in pay growth. So using the RTI data, for example, there are record highs in pay growth when comparing it on the same month a year ago in both median pay and mean pay. In this case, the record is only going back to the middle of 2015, but it still really is a peculiarity, especially from the point of view, from a sort of economics 101 point of view, where one might expect that during a pandemic, pay growth might be more subdued because of tough labour market circumstances, meaning that people might take lower, might accept lower pay in order to get a job, or might only be able to negotiate a lower pay rise with their employer in order to keep their job. So yes, there's this question, why is pay growth so high? And this question is also present in the AWE data, the official measure of earnings. It's not at an all-time high, but it is still higher than one might expect during such an unprecedented economic downturn. So we can actually analyze the data from a statistical point of view to show the sort of statistical processes that are causing this. So in the November RTI bulletin, this little bit of analysis was produced. So every single month in the bulletin, we're showing these inflows and outflows numbers. So changes in employment, very simply, each month can be due to either people coming in to payrolled employment, or can be due to leaving payrolled employment. And with the RTI data, the net effect of inflows and outflows perfectly equals the net change in payrolled employees. So it's a really good analytical tool, both in and of itself. If you have a look at that during April, for example, a really key insight is that the fall in payrolled employees came from equally a fall in inflows to an increase in outflows. Whereas then you can see that that initial big increase in outflows, actually since then outflows have been more subdued than their pre-COVID trend. But this was offset by the fact that inflows were also lower. And that's what's caused a net decrease in employees over that time. But we can actually follow through and see what the effect of these inflows and outflows is on mean pay. So we can statistically exactly decompose growth in mean pay into the growth that's due to continuously employed people in payrolled in employee jobs, but then the contributions that's due to inflows and the contribution due to outflows. Now, inflows are generally paid less than people in continuous employment, around 40% less. So the effect of inflows of these people coming in who are paid less is to drag down pay growth. That's why you can see these blue bars come in negative. And prior to the pandemic, this was dragging down pay growth by about 4 percentage points a year. Whereas outflows are also paid less in general than people in continuous employment, but not as much less than inflows. It's only about 20%. So as these low pay people leave payrolled employment, that tends to push up pay slightly. So you can see that they were having a bit of an upwards contribution. But if you have a look at those blue bars right in the most recent period, you'll see that that downward contribution went from being about -4 percentage points to now it's just around 2.5 percentage points. So that's an extra 1.5 percentage points pushing up on pay growth compared to what was happening before the pandemic. So one of the reasons that pay growth is this high is sort of a statistical effect of what impact inflows tend to have on pay. Whereas you just look at those grey bars there, that's the contribution that's coming from people in continuous employment. Actually, that's still a little subdued compared to prior to the downturn. So it's really interesting to be able to dig out and find that this these inflows and outflows effects are impacting on pay, and that's why they're producing the slightly counterintuitive effect that we see. So I want to end this by talking from an analyst perspective. So all of this has been talking about the RTI bulletin, which is published monthly in a joint publication by ONS and HMRC, which I'm now no longer involved in. But yeah, that's still coming out. But the design of the RTI calendarization methodology was also designed for analysts who want to use the microdata. So, it was designed for analysts in HMRC, but not just HMRC, analysts in ONS who might want to do all sorts of things with the data to study what's going on in the labour market, but also analysts outside of either these different institutions, academics. So, as an analyst, somebody who's worked on this in the past, I want to talk about what some of those things that we are thinking about when designing that methodology are. To be clear, this in no way means that this is what's going to go into the RTI bulletin. This is just from an analyst perspective of the sort of things we could, as analysts, work on. So the sort of attributes the data now have, it's timely and detailed. That's really useful because you could produce things like detailed geographical breakdowns. The RTI bulletin actually now does contain geographical breakdowns that are NUTS1 region. You could produce high frequency analysis. So the calendarization methodology, as I was originally talking about it, essentially produces daily estimates of employment that are then aggregated up to a monthly level. You could analyze those data on their daily basis to be able to really understand things like big one-off events that you might expect to have an immediate effect on employment, and therefore maybe also try and isolate the specific effect of that event compared to other events that might happen during the month. Finally, because the RTI data is an employer-employee linked analysis, it'd be really great. You could do analysis of inequality within and between firms, for example, breaking down things like the gender pay gap into its within firm and between firm components. And then finally, it has this longitudinal analysis where you can follow people across time. And that could have all sorts of really interesting avenues for analysing labour market progression that we haven't been able to do before, such as, for example, analysing the pay premium that might be associated with moving house. So, for example, if people want to analyse the impact of a more dynamic housing market, the impact that could have on the labour market and having a more efficient allocation of labour between regions, you could use this longitudinal element of the data to be able to follow people across time. So with all of that brings me to the end of my part. I've just put up my contact details here in case anybody has any questions after the event. Cliodhna@ons.gov.uk. But also because I'm no longer head of the RTI statistics team, please feel free to email them if you have any questions specifically about their RTI bulletin. And with that, I think I've made time fairly well. I'll hand over to Deb.
Thanks, Cliodhna. Okay, so can people, hold on. Let me share my screen. So can people see my presentation?
Not just yet, Deb, but I think it's going to come up shortly.
No, so thinking about it.
Not yet.
Oh dear. Anything yet?
No, maybe try unsharing and sharing again.
It's coming.
Oh, something's happening. Yes, there it is.
It's got it now.
We got that in the end, guys. Okay. So I've only got one screen today, so I can't see what you can see. So hopefully I'm not making too many faces here. Okay, so I'm Debra and I work in ONS on the labour market team. And so, as Daria said at the beginning, I work mainly on bringing the publications together. So I don't do any of the clever stuff that goes on in producing the numbers, but bring it all together in the end. And I work with HMRC on the publication of the RTI bulletin as well. So what I'm just going to cover, and my presentation will probably last around 10 minutes, is the development of the RTI joint bulletin. And then I'll move on to just talk a little bit about the challenges that we faced in measuring the labour market through COVID. And then I'll talk a little bit about how RTI compares with some of our existing labour market sources. So mainly the LFS, Labour Force Survey, and then AWE, the Average Weekly Earnings. So Cliodhna might have touched on some of these points already. The first bulletin was introduced in December 2019, so that was the first joint publication with ONS and HMRC, and it's published on Labour Market Release Day. It's a day where we put out quite a lot of bulletins from ONS, but also the devolved administrations have some bulletins as well. So it's put out on that day so that we could better tell the labour market story. So that was the first one in December 2019. And then in April 2020, we included a flash estimate of payroll employees. So that would have included a March estimate of the payroll employees that we published in the middle of April. And before that, we would have had just information from the LFS that would have taken us up to end of February. So we were able to produce more timely stats on that. And then in May, we introduced the flash estimates of median earnings. So again, our other sources, our existing sources, weren't that timely. So it would have gone up until the end of March, whereas the RTI data enabled us to publish estimates for April. And then more recently, in October, we published the flash monthly regional data. So that's at NUTS 1 level. So that was for employees and earnings. And then just on Tuesday, last Tuesday, we've included the industrial data on RTI. So again, employees and earnings. So HMRC have worked really hard in developing all of this, and we kind of publish it all. And the industry data got really well received on Tuesday. So there was lots of press coverage about the fall in payroll employees, and around a third of it coming from the hospitality industry. So that was really well received. So moving on, just to talk a little bit now about the challenges that we faced ourselves within ONS on our existing sources and the data collection there. So a lot of the existing data sources that we have are from the household surveys or the business surveys. We've had lots of issues with data collection, response, and so one of our household surveys, the LFS, our interviewers weren't able to go out and knock on doors and capture that wave one information through a face-to-face interview. So we had to move the wave one interviews to telephone. So there was a challenges right at the start of COVID with that. Also with the business surveys, obviously lots of businesses weren't able to work right at the start. And so it proved challenging trying to get information on the number of employees and earnings through our business surveys. So it helps a lot to have an alternative data source in RTI where we were able to just continue because it's admin data. And on our existing sources as well, we had some methodology challenges. So there was issues with imputation on the business surveys where it might not have been appropriate to take the previous month or the previous year to impute that value. And we also had weighting issues on the LFS where different people was responding to our survey, therefore we had to review the weighting methodology. And we clearly had the impact of CJRS and SACE. And so we had to think about how we tried to capture in those in our surveys. So some of the things we did with that was we added some new questions to our labour force survey to try and understand how people were claiming benefits and who was furloughed. So they were all very quick things that we had to respond to within a very short space of time. So it was obviously very helpful for us to have new data sources, but equally having new data sources, sometimes it becomes challenging when they don't always tally up. So the next few slides are from an article that we published on December the 11th that talked about our different data sources and how they compare with each other. And so this data that comes up now isn't the latest data because it's just pulled from the article that was published pre the latest publication. So apologies that it's not the latest data that's being shown. So this is just a table of the differences between RTI and labour force survey. The labour force survey is how we measure employment. So RTI, as Cliodhna has said, is admin data. It's a database of all individuals receiving pay through PAYE. There's lots of imputation and there are lots of methodologies that you've heard, and it has inclusions and exclusions. So in this article that we published on the 11th of December, it'll detail lots of the exclusions and inclusions. I've just put a few key ones here. So RTI includes under 16s, whereas LFS doesn't. It includes all those in communal establishments, whereas LFS will include some, but not all. RTI will exclude the people on in the undeclared economy, so the people who are paid cash in hand. And there's the schemes where no one earns above the lower earning limit, so they would be excluded from RTI, which would be included in LFS. The LFS is a sample of the UK households and it follows an international definition. So this is pretty key in that the definition of employment on the LFS is that someone has to be working or that is temporarily away from work that they expect to return to. The information is collected via an interviewer. So at the moment, through the telephone, and a lot of the respondent information that we get is self-defined. So they define through these questions that we ask if they're employed, and then if they're an employee or if they're self-employed. There's lots of methodologies again, different methodologies that are involved on the LFS. So we wait for the population estimates, and there's obviously going to be some bias and sampling variability. I've probably covered most of the includes and excludes already, but LFS main employment does cover self-employed as well. We'll just go on to the next slide. Again, this isn't the latest data. So as you can see, the colors are not great because I've taken this from our website. So you might find this a little bit difficult reading this, but the top series is employment from the LFS, and as you can see, it's consistently higher, and that is just because self-employed are included in that series. Generally, though, they trend pretty well over time. So I should explain, just in case you can't see it, that the middle line is the RTI series and the bottom line is the LFS employee series. So it's the RTI and the LFS employee series that are kind of measuring the same thing or attempting to measure employees. So self-employed is included in the LFS employment and generally trend well over time, apart from towards the end of the series, the COVID impact, where RTI is showing falls, employees is relatively stable, but the LFS employment series is also showing falls, just not as steep as RTI. And then this is just the same, this is just showing the annual growth, but the same story. So they generally trend well over the series, apart from towards the end, the COVID impact, where RTI is showing steeper falls. So moving on. So what we've found is that we've tried to understand this, and what we can see is that there's a number of people who are self-employed on the LFS. So as I said before, self-employment is self-defined on the LFS. So a respondent can tell us themselves if they're self-employed or an employee. And what we found is that the number of self-employed people who are saying that they're doing the same job, but they're changing, they're switching their status. So they're moving from self-employed to an employee. We've always had a number of those through the series, but towards the end of 2019 and into the COVID period, we've seen that increase quite a lot. And what we think is that through COVID and the benefits that have become available to people, people may be defining themselves, defining their status slightly differently now in COVID times. So they're now, as an employee, as a self-employed person that would have said they were self-employed on the LFS previously, they now might be receiving CJRS and therefore on the LFS are now defining themselves as an employee. So that helps us a little explain how we're seeing the LFS employees. It's pretty stable, but the LFS employment is showing those falls. So what we've got here is we've got a number, the difference in LFS employment, the change in LFS employment over time since the start of the start of COVID, so the end of March. We've got the change in LFS employment, and when we added questions to the LFS at the start of April, we added a question to employees that asked if they were away from work and what pay they were receiving. So were they receiving full, partial, or no pay? And we've got a number of people on the LFS that are saying that they're away from work, but they expect to return to their job. So we classify them as employed, but they are not receiving any pay. And that's what this blue bar is at the bottom. So they're still in our count of employment, but on RTI, they're likely to have fallen out of RTI because they're not receiving any pay. So when we look at those and the change in the LFS employment, we see that we have quite similar trends to RTI. So that has helped us. This is some of the work that we've been doing recently, trying to understand these differences. So just to summarize on the LFS side of things, so we've obviously got quite a lot of work to continue to do to understand the differences between RTI and LFS, and especially the puzzle where there's lots of switches from self-employed to employees. But the article that we published, and it's linked at the end of this presentation, we attempt to suggest to users when might be the most appropriate time to use which series. So for RTI, we think that for more timely estimates of the payroll employees, you should use RTI. It's obviously a month ahead, and now we have region and industry. So it gives us quite a lot of additional information in a more timely way. And then for everything else to use the LFS goes back to 1971 for some series, 92 for most other series. And it's broken down by lots and lots of different characteristics that are not available on RTI and are not collected for tax purposes. So we've got age, sex, ethnicity, occupation, hours. Some will be available on RTI and may be developed in the future, but things like occupation, hours, ethnicity, they're not available on LFS. So if you need any breakdowns on those, then to use the LFS. I think that's it on the LFS and the employment side. So moving on to earnings. So we've got two main sources of earnings information. So now RTI, but our existing and our main official source is from the AWE, average weekly earnings. So I won't really talk about the RTI bit here because we've covered some of this, but for AWE, it's a survey of businesses in Great Britain. And we ask companies questions on how many people they have employed and their total earnings. And then AWE is calculated on a jobs basis, so RTI is calculated on a person basis, and I think Cliodhna covered that earlier. We've got slightly different reference periods, so that might suggest why we may see some differences. We think that AWE excludes redundancy payments. We think that RTI will be including many of the redundancy payments. And we're seeing redundancies at a record high at the moment. So that might suggest why RTI is slightly higher than AWE. And this is showing a comparison over time. So again, like the LFS series, they trend well over time. And then even into the COVID period, we see similar trends. RTI is slightly higher than AWE. Again, these colours are a little bit hard to read, even for me, so they're probably hard for you. But they've taken from our website, so apologies. RTI is the higher series here, and from the reasons before, so RTI being on a person basis, AWE being on a jobs basis, and RTI potentially including redundancy payments, that explains why RTI is slightly higher. But they do show some very similar similar trends. RTI has got a slightly higher growth than AWE. So again, in the article, we suggest when you may want to use the two series. So AWE has got a longer time series. It's available back to 2000. So any longer term analysis, it is better to use AWE. AWE is also available split by total, regular and bonus, which isn't available split on RTI at the moment. And we also have a public-private split on AWE. RTI, though, like we said, is more timely. So for the more timely analysis to look at RTI, and we now have RTI regional earnings information. So our earnings information regionally would have only been able to come from ASH, which is an annual data set, which we publish in around October, November each year. So this offers us huge potential in being able to understand the earnings across the UK by region. So as I've said throughout, really, that HMRC are continuing to develop the bulletin, and we're working alongside them. Any ideas that you have in understanding the differences, and I'm sure that some of the questions and thoughts will come up here. It'll be useful to hear what you think, because we have quite a lot of work in ONS and with HMRC to understand the differences, and that will be like our work program going into 2021 to try and dig down more into that and try to quantify the differences where possible. But it will be hugely complex. And just to really end this, RTI is hugely useful as a data source for ONS. It helps us tell a more timely story, and at the moment that's what users really need, so it is widely reported, but it does give us some challenges when they move in slightly different ways. But hopefully we are understanding those differences better now. And I think that might be my last slide. So, okay, I've included contacts as well on here, and then some useful links. So, and I think Cliodhna mentioned that bottom one in their presentation. So I've just added it in, but we've got links to the Labour Market Bulletin and then links to the article that we published that I've mentioned throughout here, which is comparing the data sources. So I think that's it.
Thank you both very much for your presentations. That was really, really interesting, and I'm still digesting everything you've said. While I'm still digesting that, do any of the folks in the audience want to kick us off with asking questions? If you'd like to use the sort of raise hand feature or type a question into the chat. Holly Young, you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I work for the ONS. I work in the data development unit, and we're working on the pay data, or attempting to. I just kind of wondered, come relatively new into it, like how the dynamics of the joint publication work. So, am I right that it's HMRC's, like so the CAI feed that you're using, and then what are the dynamics of split and how that's tended to work, or what some of the challenges have been?
So I have to admit that HMRC do all the clever work, and they send us everything to publish. So they send us the bulletin and the tables, the aggregate tables, and we publish it and pull that story together. Does that answer your question, Holly?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Liam, we've got a question from you in the chat. So thanks firstly to our speakers. And is the question mainly for Cliodhna, possibly for Deb. So pay is likely to be a heavily skewed data set, and therefore mean could be inflated by an increased contribution. Sorry, apologies, my screen is flickering, so I'm going to have to move to a different screen. Let me start again, apologies. So pay is likely to be a heavily skewed data set, and therefore mean could be inflated by an increased contribution from the wealthiest earners. If instead you looked at the modal pay growth post-COVID-19, would you expect to see the same trends that you have shown? Or could you decompose those figures about pay growth by earnings level to determine where the increased pay growth is coming from?
Sure. So I'll talk about that first. So, I mean, it's a very good question, and exactly the sort of thing that you can get out of the RTI data that's really useful. So about your point about it's the data set likely being skewed, actually data on that is published as part of the RTI publication. So alongside publishing median pay, they also do produce the distribution of pay. So from the 10th percentile right up to the 90th, the 95th and the 99th percentile of the distribution. So you can go in and it's in the bulletin of comparing how those fare, particularly over the resulting from the pandemic. So there is data in the RTI bulletin currently to analyze that. But you also mentioned this idea that there can be a distribution, or well, there's a distribution not only of pay levels, but also there is a distribution of pay growth. And you raise this idea of looking at modal pay as a way of trying to detach from mean pay growth is a plutocratic measure of pay growth. Those at the highest end of the distribution have the biggest weight in determining how mean pay growth moves over time. That you suggested you could look at the modal pay growth of tracking people across time and having a look at their pay growth. You can definitely do that. I've produced similar analysis using ASH in the past. One of the things to think about with pay growth is that sometimes you can get what would you call it, multi-peaks in the distribution of growth, particularly during periods, for example, when you get public sector pay freezes, where I remember in previous years, in 2011 and 2012 in particular, you could see multiple peaks in pay growth distributions. This was using ASH data. So one of the issues there is sometimes you could have two peaks that are almost equal, where picking solely the modal peak might not give you the full information. But so one of the things as an analyst you could do is just have a look in general at the distribution of pay growth. That could be quite interesting. One of the things that has been published, though, that might be useful if you want this data now, is I believe last month the RTI team produced median pay growth. So again, taking that distribution of pay growth and taking the middle point of that distribution. So again, that's a much more, again, using this plutocratic, democratic terminology that's sometimes used in the literature. That's a more democratic measure of pay growth, in that it gives the pay growth that half of people experience less than that and half of people experience more than that. And again, in comparing that, as they do in the bulletin, you find that the pay growth in the most recent period is a much more subdued if you use this this alternate method. So yes, it's definitely the sort of thing you can do. Trying to analyze this impact of the skew of the data using the RTI data. And to a certain extent, that's already happening in the RTI bulletin. They do a really good job with that. But there still is more scope. The RTI data can be used by analysts to really dig down into the effect that has.
I don't think I've missed any questions. So I've got a question. So the RTI statistics, I mean, okay, are relatively new, I think, compared to the other data sources, even though, of course, they've been around for many months and have already proved their great value. But when the statistics were new, or even maybe now, are there any sort of really common misconceptions about the RTI data that you've come across?
Sure. So I'll come across this one first, although I'm sure Deb may have come across some other ones in what you've done. So there's two that personally I think might be helpful to flag up. I talked about it earlier, but one of the things about this data is we are looking at whether or not people are employed over a particular period, and we calculate these daily estimates of employment, and then the monthly figures then are an average of those daily estimates. So I've come across quite a few people reporting this as this number of people were paid during that month, whereas actually it's a number of people employed during that month, and the fact that it's a monthly average of those figures is a really important part of it. The other point that I've come across as well as that is that because we do have all of this work that goes in, there's also some extra bits that are included in the methodological article. This isn't us just taking the raw RTI data and calculating, for example, pay data from it. We do have these adjustments where we are trying to bring it more in line with labour market estimates. So I have seen some people talking about this, that it's just using the raw RTI data, and mentioning the fact that they as a tax data and payments data is not appropriate as a labour market statistic. That we do a lot of these methodologies are designed to tackle that exact issue. So that's the other thing that I would point out, that we this isn't just the raw RTI data, it is in its own way an almost different data set.
And I'd build on Cliodhna's last point in a lot of people think that these two series are doing and measuring the same thing, and they're not. And so it's just trying to get that across, that they are very different, and the LFS is in line with international standards, whereas RTI is there for tax purposes. So while really useful and useful to use together and very powerful together, they are very different.
Yep. Thanks very much, both. Are there any more questions from people on the call? Sorry, again, my screen is flickering. Let me flick back to the other one. We have a question from Simon Clark. So any views on how we could or are measuring the size of the Black economy by sector?
So I might jump in here. So this sort of gets at this gets at one of the questions about what the purpose of the RTI data should be. So obviously I now work in ONS, and there are all sorts of international guidelines about what the coverage of our statistics should be, and you measure the Black economy, what's included in GDP, what's included in the national accounts, and almost by definition, there's an extent to which RTI isn't going to include aspects of the Black economy that I assume here actually that you're talking about bits of the economy that might be illicit. So, for example, GDP does include estimates of drugs and prostitution. That if we want to try and get estimates of that, RTI might not be the best source of it. So this leads into a larger debate of how many adjustments would we like to make to things like the RTI data or administrative data to bring them in line with these international guidelines for how we'd bring them into a national accounting framework. So, do we want to add in estimates of these things that we think the RTI don't include, so it sort of gets closer to these estimates? Or do we want to use the RTI data in its own terms as a slightly different way of approaching these issues? Deb mentioned earlier the ways in which the fact that RTI is different to LFS it can be quite useful during a period where traditional surveys can't contact households. It's useful to have one that is just based on tax records. In addition, during periods where Deb mentioned about sampling and about, I mentioned earlier that it can be a problem with the RTI data that we don't have a sample frame, we don't have an estimate of the universe that we need to hit. It could be an advantage to a certain extent that RTI doesn't take for granted estimates of the universe of the population that it calculates them, and it could, if for one reason or another you expect your universe to have changed in a really small amount of time, that you might expect the population of the UK to change in some sort of way in a really short-term fashion, then RTI wouldn't take the population as given. It could allow it to change. So there are these questions about how much do you want to keep RTI as being something that's different and you value that, or how much would you want to bring it in line with other national accounting frameworks? And I don't think that that's exactly decided yet, other than to answer your question very directly and say RTI is a very good thing for particularly measuring the illicit economy.
Thank you very much, Cliodhna. Any other questions? Again, feel free to raise a hand and ask the question, or type into the chat. Okay, while others are deciding, sorry, go on, Cliodhna, you were going to say something?
I was going to hop in. Sorry to do this, but halfway through answering the question, I realised there might be a slightly different interpretation depending, of course, how you the terminology you're using. The black economy that there's used in the literature of talking about the illicit economy or the black economy. It's this bit of the economy that for one reason or another isn't legal, or it's in a grey area of the economy. But I sort of want to take the alternate way of interpreting your statement of the ethnicity of data and the demographic aspects of the data. What if we want to try and measure the economy, measure particularly wages of black workers, of Asian workers, etc. That, as Deb pointed out earlier, this is one of the weaknesses of the RTI data, that we don't have the plethora of demographic information that comes from LFS. So if you do really want to do that sort of demographic analysis, then LFS is the way to go.
Brilliant, thanks very much. Hopefully that question has now been answered from both perspectives. Simon, if you'd like to clarify, or if you'd like to sort of ask any follow-ups, do please say or type. We do have a few more minutes, so if anyone else would like to ask another question, please do. But if not, I have probably a final one, just from a sort of I guess, as someone who's interested in data science but is not a data scientist. I know very little about the RTI data, but from just the nature of it, I imagine this must be one heck of a big data set. So do you have any reflections on kind of what challenges that pose in terms of developing the statistics?
Well, I mean, there are members of the RTI team on the call who I'm sure could give even more insight into this than I could, who are actually sort of in that sense of the coalface and work on this more heavily. It is working with this data. It does take a long time to really think through the processing of it. As much as this is a discussion about methodology, actually an awful lot of work goes into how to make those processes as efficient as possible in order to process them. It's a key part, actually. All this talk about how do we develop a methodology to make the data as timely as possible. I could have as comprehensive a discussion about how do we change the processing of the data in a particular way in which we code it up, so that we can get the data to be more timely. That's almost as important a question as can you develop the methodologies theoretically to make timely data. And I think that's that's going to be one of the key questions that, I mean, personally, I haven't seen discussed so much in a lot of avenues, that a lot of the interest in administrative data almost takes these things as a given. But in terms of processing the timely data and having to do these complex methodologies on it, it does become it becomes a very important issue that the more discussion of that one can get, the better.
Brilliant. Yes, that was probably quite a large question to have as a final one. So I'm sure that's maybe something we can cover in a later meeting. But I mean, this has been really, really interesting. So thank you both again for your presentations. With 1 minute left, I will do a final last call for questions. If anyone has anything short.
I just want to add one thing in the whole. Obviously, the data set is very complex, and we just are very grateful and thankful to HMRC for putting so much effort, and Cliodhna in putting so much effort into the development of it. So, yeah, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, by the sounds of it, this is, an amazing thing to have produced and also in such a short time. So yeah, really a brilliant data set, and also two very brilliant presentations, which have been absolutely fascinating. So thank you both very much for presenting, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining.